What if the most important waterway on Earth didn't close, but instead stayed open on purpose? What if Iran controlled the Strait of Hormuz, the single artery carrying nearly 1/5 of the world's oil, and yet allowed global trade to continue under its terms? No blockade, no full shutdown. Just silent control over who moves when they move and at what cost. That's not war anymore. That's leverage over civilization itself. Because the moment one nation can decide the price of global stability without firing a single shot at full scale, the world doesn't panic instantly, it slowly begins to obey. Oil doesn't just move, it negotiates. Shipping doesn't just travel, it calculates permission. And economies don't crash overnight, they start adjusting to a new unseen authority. This is not about closing a strait. This is about redefining global power without announcing a war. And the terrifying question is this: if everything still flows, but only through permission, is the world really free or already controlled? Power doesn't always announce itself with closure. Sometimes it reveals itself through anticipation. In the case of the Strait of Hormuz, the real shift begins when the choke point is no longer a physical barrier, but a psychological one. When Iran does not shut the passage, but controls its tempo, the world enters a state where every shipment carries awareness of unseen permission. From a psychological lens, men often interpret such environments through dominance, risk, and control, where uncertainty becomes a silent challenge to authority and survival thinking. It triggers a mindset of calculation, readiness, and pressure to respond rather than react. From a broader social perspective, women often evaluate the same system through stability, continuity, and trust in supply chains, focusing on how predictability sustains families, markets, and daily life rather than who holds leverage in the background. In both views, the choke point stops being geography and becomes perception. True control is not the act of stopping movement, but the ability to make movement depend on permission. When trade continues but under invisible conditions, global systems begin to adjust behavior without formal orders being issued. Shipping routes are reevaluated, pricing absorbs risk before it appears, and decision makers start to internalize constraints they cannot see but must respect. This is where power shifts from physical enforcement to psychological alignment, where influence is exercised not through interruption, but through expectation itself. When trade stops being an open system and becomes something that requires permission, the entire foundation of global confidence begins to shift. Power is no longer measured by how much you can produce or transport, but by who you must acknowledge before you do it. From a psychological perspective, men tend to interpret this as a challenge to autonomy and status, where control over movement becomes tied to identity, decision-making, and the instinct to resist unseen authority. It creates pressure, not just economically, but internally, where every action feels like it is being weighed against an invisible gatekeeper. From a broader perspective, women often respond by focusing on the consequences of this shift on stability, how families, markets, and long-term security are affected when access to essential goods depends on approval rather than certainty. Control becomes more powerful when it is quiet. Instead of stopping ships, the system simply learns that nothing moves without acknowledgement of the controlling force. Businesses adapt their strategies around risk premiums, governments adjust their diplomacy around access, and economies begin to price in permission as a permanent condition. Over time, what once felt like free movement transforms into managed flow, where every decision carries an unspoken requirement to align with power before progress is possible. A silent tax is the most powerful form of control because it is never officially announced, yet it is always paid. When energy flows through a strategic choke point like the Strait of Hormuz under controlled conditions, every barrel of oil carries more than physical value, it carries an invisible cost of uncertainty. From a psychological perspective, men often process this as a pressure system tied to competition and survival thinking, where control over resources translates into status, leverage, and the ability to protect or provide under unstable conditions. It creates a mindset of constant readiness, where decisions are influenced by unseen variables that can shift advantage at any moment. From another perspective, women tend to interpret this silent tax through the lens of household and societal stability, where rising costs ripple into daily life, food security, and long-term economic confidence. Power in this system does not announce itself through disruption. It embeds itself into pricing, contracts, and have expectations. Shipping companies add risk premiums before any incident occurs. Insurers adjust rates based on anticipation rather than reality. And markets normalize instability as part of the baseline cost of doing business. What makes this form of influence so effective is that it spreads gradually, shaping behavior without direct confrontation until the world no longer distinguishes between natural cost and imposed pressure. Markets rarely break the way people imagine. They don't explode, they adapt. When a strategic choke point like the Strait of Hormuz is controlled but not closed, the global economy doesn't face a dramatic shutdown. It enters a state of structured compliance. From a psychological lens, men often interpret this shift through competition and hierarchy, where the real tension lies in who sets the conditions of participation. It triggers a mindset focused on calculation, leverage, and strategic response because control over energy flow becomes synonymous with control over global momentum. From another perspective, women often perceive this transformation through stability and continuity, focusing on how families, jobs, and national systems adjust quietly to rising costs and shifting reliability without visible crisis. Compliance begins when uncertainty becomes predictable enough to be priced in. Oil markets adjust not because supply disappears, but because access carries implied conditions. Traders begin to anticipate constraints before they happen. Governments reshape alliances around reliability, and corporations restructure logistics to avoid exposure. What looks like stability on the surface is actually adaptation under pressure, where every participant in the system slowly aligns their behavior to avoid disruption. Over time, compliance replaces resistance, not through force, but through repeated expectation management embedded into every transaction. Power no longer needs warheads to be felt, it only needs leverage over systems the world. Love cannot function without. When control over a choke point like the Strait of Hormuz exists without full closure, influence shifts from destruction to direction, from force to expectation. From a psychological standpoint, men often interpret this kind of power through dominance and strategic positioning, where the ability to influence global movement becomes tied to identity, strength, and the instinct to stay ahead in a silent competition. It activates a mindset of pressure and calculation, where every shift in access feels like a move on a larger unseen board. From another perspective, women often evaluate this form of power through its impact on continuity and human security, focusing on how families, communities, and economies remain stable or become strained under invisible control mechanisms. This new form of global weapon is not loud, but structural. It does not destroy infrastructure, it reshapes behavior around it. Shipping routes adjust before they are forced to, prices absorb. Have risk before it is realized, and governments align diplomacy around maintaining access rather than challenging it. Power becomes most effective when it is internalized by everyone involved, when the system itself begins to self-regulate based on anticipation of influence rather than direct action. The moment geography begins to control economics, power stops being abstract and becomes physical reality. A narrow waterway like the Strait of Hormuz is not just a route for oil, it becomes a reminder that global prosperity can hinge on a few miles of water. From a psychological standpoint, men often process this shift through control, competition, and strategic dominance, where physical position translates into perceived strength and influence. It triggers a mindset built on anticipation, where advantage is measured by who can shape movement before it even begins. From another perspective, women often interpret this same reality through stability and interdependence, focusing on how geographic pressure points affect families, prices, and the quiet predictability that everyday life depends on. When geography becomes an economic force, distance is no longer neutral. It becomes charged with meaning, risk, and negotiation. Shipping lanes are no longer just lines on a map. They become economic lifelines that respond to tension before conflict even appears. Markets begin to behave like living systems, reacting to terrain, adjusting expectations based on access rather than intention. Over time, control is no longer about who produces the most, but who sits at the most critical intersections of movement and flow, where land and water quietly define the limits of global ambition.